All right, we're into the second half of the semester now. We can all take a deep breath and look ahead. This section of the syllabus is called Capitalism and Colonialism. We're going to devote quite a bit of time to these subjects. 6 lectures total. One of them will be a movie, so I guess that's 5 lectures. Today we're going to talk about kinds of capital, sugar, and slavery, and try to sort of initiate this discussion, which will occupy us for the next month and a half. Or no, I'm sorry, month. Why is this not working? There we go. Here's an update. Next week, there's a map quiz. I realize this seems like a lot of map quizzes in a row, but it's because we bumped the one from last week. We bumped Latin America back a week. And that's why it feels like we're getting them too many in a row. But I apologize. I posted the map and the list of items yesterday. Bibliographies for your papers are due in sections the week after break. And I wanted to remind you of that now so that you have that on your radar screen here in the next couple weeks. How many of you have started your bibliography research already? A handful of you. Good. Is it going well? No. Anyone else? Okay, I got one going good in the back. Would it be useful... How many have you had a chance in sections to sort of actually watch somebody do one of these preliminary searches? Would that be useful to do? Maybe we should do that in class. We could do that today. Yeah, maybe we'll do that today just to break things up a little bit. The readings, I'm going to run you through the readings for the entirety of this section of the syllabus, okay? They're in the slides. For today, as I wrote on the board last time, the reading is the first 11 pages of Henry Bernstein's article in the Reader. For Tuesday of next week, I want you to read the next 13 pages of that article, sections 11.3 and 11.4. I also would like you to read the Weber passages or selections from the Reader, which I failed to write on the board last time. So those were not for today, but they are for next week. Tuesday, the 30th of March. So next week we'll do Bernstein and Weber. Then we'll watch a movie on Thursday of next week, the last class before break. We'll watch Black Gold, Wake Up and Smell the Coffee. After break, first reading back will be selections from the Reader by Karl Marx. For Thursday, April 1st, I'd like you to read George Orwell's short essay, Shooting an Elephant. And then for Tuesday, April 6th, I'd like you to read Chapter 2 of Delaney. By that date, I also would like you to have read pages 42 to 69 in the Atlas. Are there any questions about that? No? Okay. Here are our big questions for this section of the course. Why did European states set off around the world beginning in the 15th century? How did they reshape the peoples and lands they encountered? What legacies have those encounters left politically, economically, culturally, and ecologically? Now, of course, we've already started to look at some of the answers to these questions, right? The discussion of the Great Dying and the Neo-Europes, in a sense, has already introduced us to these questions. We have not, however, started to really look systematically at what happened beyond those events, or what it really means that the Neo-Europes became the Neo-Europes, whereas other parts of the Americas, Asia, Africa, aren't part of what Crosby calls the Neo-Europes. Other things happened there, right? And we need to start differentiating between different cases or instances of this European expansion and influence on peoples and places elsewhere. And we need to start thinking about what the logic of those subsequent developments is, how to think about them. And that's what we're going to start to do today. Now, I would encourage you to read the Bernstein article very carefully. It might feel like just a chapter from a textbook, and in fact it is a chapter from a textbook. And it might read in a fairly kind of textbook kind of way that's not all that exciting. However, it contains the key concepts for most of the rest of the semester. If you get a good solid grasp on colonialism, capitalism, and development, it will make everything else we do this semester a lot easier for you to understand. These are the really basic processes or phenomena that we're going to use to try to make sense of what's happened in the world in the last 500 years. And they will be relevant even for the last 50 years when we come back and return to Davis and think about urbanization in the present day. Bernstein's exposition is admirably clear. So if you read it the first time and think, oh, well, this is fairly straightforward, I would encourage you to go ahead and read it a second time, because even though it seems very clear, and it is clear, the things he's talking about are conceptually very dense and difficult to get everything out of on a single read. And it's a more efficient way to make sense of these things than a lot of other ways you might try to improve your intuitive grasp of this, okay? So in the pages that I asked you to read for today, he offers up some definitions. We're going to start with his definitions of colonization and colonialism, and by the end of lecture, we'll arrive at his definition of capitalism. So colonization, he says, is settlement of new territory by a group of people. And that's it. That's all you need for it to be a case of colonization. People pick up from one place, go to another place, and set up a colony. They decide to live there. They stay there. Colonialism is political control of peoples and territories by foreign states. Now, obviously, you can have both, but you don't necessarily have both. And that's why we need to distinguish between the two of them. These are overlapping but non-identical phenomena or concepts. So what's an example of colonialism in view of Crosby? Using Crosby, how would you illustrate this distinction? Yeah. Okay. When the Native Americans came across the land bridge from up at the Bering Strait and settled across the Americas, they colonized it. That's definitely true. But the Europeans established colonial control, colonialism, over the Americas. That's also correct. What about the distinction between Neo-Europes and other places? What are the Neo-Europes an example of? Or what are the not Neo-Europes, the other parts of Asia, Africa, and so forth that didn't become Neo-Europes? Did they experience colonization? I guess we haven't gotten there. Crosby didn't go into this. I mean, Crosby's big distinction is that the Neo-Europes, the Europeans actually become the dominant group demographically, right? They actually displace the native peoples and sort of take over as the residents. And the previous residents become a very small, insignificant, perhaps non-existent part of the population. In other parts of the so-called, the rest of the world besides Europe, this didn't happen. You could have colonialism, the exertion of political control over territory and peoples without having significant European demographic presence, right? So this is the initial distinction. And actually, when most of Crosby, he's not even gotten to the part about colonialism yet, has he? He talks about the arrival of the Europeans in the Americas, and he talks about the Great Dying and the consequences of their arrival sort of immediately. But he doesn't pause to say very much about the political systems that then get put together and established, extended across the Americas. So the question of colonialism scarcely comes up. But we're going to have to look at that now. So these two processes overlapped in the Americas and in Australia, whereas colonialism happened without significant colonization elsewhere in Africa and Asia. Here are some dates to give you sort of signposts for the expansion of the Portuguese, who, as we've seen already, were the earliest peoples to set off on this great adventure. By 1420, they were in Madeira, the Azores, 1427, Cape Verde Islands, 1456. By 1482, they were in the Bight of Benin, right, which is around around the big hump of West Africa and in near what's now Nigeria. They made it to the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa by 1487. They were into the Indian Ocean by 1497, and they were in Brazil by 1500. So in the space of 80 years, they had spread from that little piece of land on the far west coast of southwest corner of Europe, all the way around into the Indian Ocean and across to Brazil. And they were colonizing, and they were in the process of attempting to set up colonialism in these places. After about 1530, they had a global mercantile system of commerce and trade that connected them to Asia, where the principal target of their activities was spices, to the Americas and the sugar plantations that they established there, and to Africa, where the slave trade linked to between these different places, right? And it was all mediated by what's called bullion. Bullion referring to silver and gold used in the form of silver and gold as money. So a sort of global network, global trading system was in place by 1530. The Spanish followed shortly after this. We're all familiar with Columbus and his discovery of the New World in 1492. Balboa made it across Panama to the Pacific Ocean by 1513. Cortez conquered Mexico by 1519. Pizarro in Peru by 1530. They conquered the Philippines in 1564. And then in 1580, what happened? Spain and Portugal united. How'd they pull this off? Anybody know? Classic feudal European way of uniting two kingdoms. Yeah. They had the monarchs get married to each other. So they became unified in that fashion. And for a period of about 60 years, the Spanish and the Portuguese were unified as a sort of joint venture. Here's what's... Anybody heard of the Treaty of Tordesillas? I see one head nodding. Who brokered the Treaty of Tordesillas? This is a marvelous example of colonialism. So this is 1494. This is before there's much of anything in the way of Portuguese or Spanish settlers, colonies, in South America. Right? This is before they've conquered the Incas, before they've conquered Mexico. And what do? The Spanish and the Portuguese have a dispute about the New World. It's only just been discovered 2 years earlier, but they both claim the entirety of it for themselves. And they need a way to decide who's going to take which parts. And so where do they go? Yeah. They go to the Pope. Naturally, the Pope is the proper person to decide what to do with the New World, wouldn't you say? And what does the Pope say? The Pope says, why don't we draw a north-south line, and we'll give Portugal everything to the east of it, and we'll give Spain everything to the west of it. Makes perfect sense. That's how you would handle it if you were the Pope, wouldn't it? I mean, so hence we get, hey, I replaced the battery. This is supposed to work. Hey. And what's the legacy, there we go, of this line having been drawn there by the Pope in 1494? What difference does it make today? Yeah. That's it. To this day, the language spoken here is Portuguese. The language spoken elsewhere is Spanish, I'm sorry. Spain. The Pope and his Treaty of Tordesillas, no matter how far-fetched it may seem that the Pope and these two monarchs could sit down in Europe in 1494 and exert political control over the territories and peoples of a land that they barely even had discovered yet, they did it, so to speak. And that has had lasting effects on the world down to the very present. Okay. Now we're going to talk about kinds of capital. And this is straight from Bernstein. You can find these definitions in there. He distinguishes between three different kinds of capital: mercantile capital, finance capital, and productive capital. Mercantile capital is money invested in trade and commerce. You go somewhere, you buy something, you take it someplace else, and you sell it. And you profit from the difference between what you pay for it and what you sell it for. Mercantile here is related to merchant, right? And this was the dominant early form of capital if you went and looked at what was actually happening in this trade. The trade with Asia for spices, the trade in Africa for slaves, that kind of thing, was mercantile capital. And basically, it's making money from redistributing things rather than from making them, right? Finance capital was important in this period of time as well, but is distinct insofar as it's basically interested only in making money by lending people money and then charging interest, or in lending people money as investment in, say, a trading adventure. So bankers in parts of Northern Europe could put money up to a merchant to pay to outfit the ship and buy the initial batch of stuff that they were then going to take someplace else and sell, and the banker would get some kind of interest or dividend on that investment. So that's finance capital. And finance capital seems somewhat invisible sometimes. When you look at, you imagine these boats carrying slaves and spices and so forth around the world, it's easy to see that and say, oh, there's what it is. It's these goods or these people, these boats. Finance capital seems to be kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where it is, but it actually plays an incredibly important role in making mercantile capital possible and also in the transition from mercantile capital to productive capital as the dominant form of making profit. Okay? Finally, productive capital is invested in and profits from commodity production itself. This is capital in the full sense of the term. We will read Weber for next time. We will read Marx, discussions about what capitalism is. Capitalism, in this stricter sense, is all about this kind of capital. You aren't really talking about capitalism until this is the kind of capital that dominates in a given economic system. And he points out, Bernstein points out and emphasizes that only productive capital requires that land and labor be commodities that are bought and sold on the market. And in many ways, what we're going to be wrestling with in the next 3 or 4 weeks is understanding how that comes to be the case. In other words, how land and labor go from being not commodities to being commodities in connection with the development of capitalist production in different parts of the world. Are there any questions about that? No? Okay. So what are some of the empirical stages that we're going to work our way through and try to understand? Bernstein glosses these all in big, broad strokes. And he admits that these are big, broad strokes. He's not got the time to provide all the details that you might want for a fuller discussion. Nonetheless, broad strokes. In the 16th century, mercantile capital operating through Portuguese and Spanish crowns extracts gold, silver, and luxury goods such as spices from New World colonies and through selected African and Asian ports. This wealth flows as finance capital to northwestern Europe and contributes to greater development of manufacturing there. Manufacturing being productive capital rather than mercantile capital. So here are some of the bases, the sort of trading posts that the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English established in Asia between 1500 and 1700. You can see they had these scattered throughout southern and eastern Asia. And these were places, this was straight mercantile capitalism in the sense that all they had were these trading ports, these posts, right? They would have a sort of beachhead there, and their boats could land, and their traders could exchange goods with local suppliers. They did not attempt, at this point, to exert direct political control over the interior of these lands, but they were able, through trading networks, to extract certain kinds of goods, like spices, and buy them, put them on their boats, and ship them back to Europe, where they could sell them at significant profits. That mercantile part was successful and was carried out initially by mainly the Spanish and the Portuguese. However, it's important to understand that they were actually working with borrowed money. They were borrowing the money to underwrite these adventures from bankers in Northern Europe, not Spain and Portugal. And in effect, the bankers were the ones who ended up making the most money from this whole enterprise. And the wealth effectively flowed from Spain and Portugal north into places like the Netherlands and helped underwrite the development of, well, the rise of the Dutch and the English as rival superpowers, but also the development of manufacturing in Northern Europe. Some of the things that they traded besides spices. Here we're talking especially about from the New World. What's this? Anybody know what that is? It's the first one here on the list. It's cochineal. What is it? This is, imagine, anybody recognize what kind of plant that is? It's a cactus. It's a prickly pear cactus. Anybody know what the range of prickly pear cactus is in the Americas? pretty much can be found almost anywhere in the Americas. It's extremely widespread, huge genus. What's this stuff here on it, cochineal? It looks like some kind of fungus. And if you look carefully on prickly pear plants in certain places, you'll find it. It's actually an insect. And if you squish it between your fingers, you get this. It's a dye. It's an incredibly rich, dark red, lustrous dye. And you have to picture yourself in various parts of the Americas. This dye is incredibly valuable in Europe because one of the major industries that's developing early on in this period is textiles. And good sources for dyeing textiles are hard to come by. Indigo is another one. Cochineal grows on prickly pear cactus. They actually set up a system, basically, with the indigenous peoples of parts of Mesoamerica, where they had to pay a kind of tithe or a tax, essentially. Every month, they were responsible for handing over a certain amount of this stuff. And if they, basically, on penalty of whatever, punishment, imprisonment, this was a way of getting this stuff from the local people, gathering it up in large enough supplies, and taking it to Europe where it could be used in industrial production. Cacao, indigo, tobacco, salt, hides. Bernstein describes this interesting relationship between people living in one place who are not wage laborers. They're not technically even free people who could sell their labor if they wanted to. And they're impressed into these trading networks in a way that supplies the needs of productive capital in Europe, but which does not involve turning them into wage laborers. And we start to see the complicated ways in which different modes of production, which is another central term from Bernstein, get articulated between these different places. These terms of trade were deeply unequal. And they were unequal in a number of different ways, politically and economically. You can imagine if you're one of these mercantile capitalists, you start with money in Europe, and you buy things there with that money. You then sail across the sea, and you barter those goods for things that are made in the Americas, such as gold or sugar, or for slaves in Africa, which you can then take to the Americas and barter the slaves away for goods, which you then bring back to Europe and sell. You sell the American goods for money in Europe, having bartered them for European goods in the Americas. The value of the bartered goods becomes dependent on prices in Europe and hence subject to inflation. Does that make sense? So you have prices in the Americas that are set by barter rather than by money, but the amount that the merchant feels that he needs to get in the Americas depends on how much he had to pay for the goods he brought with him from Europe. If the prices in Europe go up and those goods become more expensive, then he will pass along those increased prices in the Americas in the form of heightened demands for whatever he's bartering for. If it costs him more to buy the guns or steel tools or whatever it is, or if he trades, either directly or through the medium of the slaves, then he's going to ask for more cochineal, for example. Because when he gets back to Europe, he's going to need to have more he can sell to cover the costs of the initial investment and still make a profit. And this becomes, if you imagine yourself as that indigenous person who has to turn over a certain amount of cochineal every month, what you are essentially discovering is that you have to go find more prickly pear cactus and scratch more of that stuff off every month because the price of whatever, textiles or steel, has gone up in Europe. These kinds of linkages actually become extremely important because Europe during this period of time was experiencing prolonged, serious inflation. Why was Europe experiencing prolonged, serious inflation? during this period. Precisely because one of the things that they were getting from the New World was bullion. The supply of gold in Europe increased by 20% because they took so much of it from the Incas and the Aztecs and took it back and claimed it as their own and brought it into their own economies, right? The silver from the one mine in Bolivia, the famous San Luis Potosi mine, helped contribute to a tripling in the supply of silver in Europe during the same time period. And if you know basic economics, you increase the supply of money in an economy without anything else increasing necessarily, and you get inflation, right? Each unit, each pound or ounce of silver or gold actually becomes worth less simply because there's more money in circulation. So now you have a situation in which the expansion of bullion, the bullion supply in Europe, directly creates the inflation that forces increased extraction of goods from the places the gold and silver came from in the first place. Now, the Spanish had a rule that if you went over to the New World flying under the Spanish flag, sailing under the Spanish flag, and you came back with a bunch of gold, 40% of it belonged to the crown. You had to take 40% of that gold and just give it to the king. The other 60% you could work with yourself. But the Spanish king basically turned around and used that gold either to mint more bullion, more money, which contributed to inflation, or turned around and paid it in interest to the bankers elsewhere in Europe from whom he was borrowing the money to pay for the adventures. You got a deflation of the currency, which is the same thing as inflation of prices, right? The currency itself becomes less valuable per unit. And you also got a sustained transfer of wealth out of Spanish and Portuguese hands into the hands of finance capitalists to the north. And this directly affects the long-term viability of the Spanish and Portuguese and contributes to their eventual dislocation by the Dutch and the French and the English. Is that all clear? Beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, the mercantile interests begin to undertake large-scale production of raw materials, especially sugar, based on slavery and plantations. So you start to see a shift. The mercantile capitalists themselves begin to invest in plantations, in other words, investing in productive capital rather than just in goods. And they set up plantations, and they begin to produce large amounts of sugar cane and process it into sugar, or perhaps turn it into rum or molasses. And this signals a number of important shifts. One is that the colonies themselves, where these plantations are set up, become markets for European manufacturers. So now you need various kinds of equipment and tools on the plantations, and the plantations become a way of creating demand for the goods being made in Europe. In addition to that, the relations of production that were developed on plantations, according to some historians, become a sort of template for relations of production back in Europe. Some of these plantations are sort of, by these arguments, the earliest examples of factory-style industrial production. And they demonstrate to these mercantile capitalists that there is a lot of money to be made, not just in the movement of goods, but in the production of goods. What develops eventually is sometimes called the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. You can see a sort of triangle here, although there'll be another map that makes it a little clearer. You see the movement of manufactured goods from Europe to the Americas, the movement of slaves from Africa to the Americas. Going the other direction, you see sugar, molasses, fruit, a variety of raw materials produced in the Americas, rice, indigo, skins, fish, furs, naval stores, that kind of thing. This trade, hang on. This trade sort of brings these different forms of production together, or unites them, right? You have mercantile capital, productive capital, and finance capital articulating between different sectors of production, different places, different kinds of goods, and even different forms of exchange. Exchange mediated by money in some cases, exchange mediated by barter in others. And this, the overall pattern, again, is linked through European markets and currencies, money, values, and prices. The Dutch have a sort of moment of glory in the 17th century in which they very rapidly grew, expanded, became wealthy, sort of booted the Portuguese and the Spanish to the side, and then were quickly booted to the side themselves. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, East India here referring to what? What is East India if you're in the Netherlands in 1600? Yeah. It's basically Asia. It's, you know, remember that this derives from that strange, just why do we call them Indians in this hemisphere? It's because Columbus thought he was going to get to India, right? So when he landed, he saw these people, he said, oh, these must be Indians. Similarly, at this time, East India refers to Asia and is a company, it's actually a corporation set up under a sort of concession or official relationship with the Dutch government to colonize or trade with East India. And this is such a success that they then set one up in 1621 for West India, which refers to the Americas, right? The Caribbean. By 1641, they had seized the Portuguese holdings in Africa, Brazil, and the Caribbean, and they'd established settlements on the east coast of North America, but most of these had been lost by 1654. Whoop. Hey, stop it. The French got involved also in the 17th century, founding Quebec in 1608, Montreal in 1642. They formed their own India Company, the French India Company. And in 1718, they founded New Orleans. So they have their sights set principally on things like skins from trapping beavers, that kind of thing. In theory, coming back to questions of the relationship between the sovereigns and the traders or the investors, the market actors, in theory, the state monopolized all trade. Anybody who tried to trade in these parts of the world without a sort of license from one of these monarchs or states was sort of automatically breaking the law, because Portugal claimed certain parts of the world as its own, and if you wanted to trade there, you had to have their permission. Spain claimed other parts, that sort of thing. The Dutch, the French, and the English traders moved into the Caribbean as the Spanish and the Portuguese power declined in the 1600s, and this is the famous period of piracy, right? Basically, a pirate was anybody who was engaged in any kind of trade without one of these licenses. And as the Spanish and the Portuguese lost their ability to enforce their territorial claims, more and more traders from other nations could move in and attempt to usurp this trade And in a sense, they were doing it illegally. But if the Spanish and the Portuguese couldn't actually enforce their claims, what were they going to be able to do about it anyway? And by the latter half of the 1500s, there was even trade going across the Pacific from the west coast of Central America, trading with China and the Philippines. And much of this was illegal precisely because none of these merchants had the sort of official license from any of these sovereigns. They were simply doing it because it was profitable, and they could get away with it. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll talk about sugar. Okay. So now we're going to talk about sugar and slavery. If we have time, we'll also do some bibliography stuff. Otherwise, I'll do it first thing next time, okay? So remember, the Portuguese were sort of the first to get into this game on a big scale. And from Crosby, you'll remember that the sugar slavery production sort of system was worked out by the Portuguese first in the Madeiras and Canary Islands, remember? And Crosby suggests that that then informed their subsequent activities in the New World, where they set up much larger slave-based plantation production of sugar. It was their main objective in colonizing Brazil, was to produce sugar. It spread throughout the Caribbean and other tropical sites. It was not only based on slave labor. Slaves did a lot of the labor, but there were also paid laborers involved in the production process, especially as it got more elaborate, complex. The division of labor required different skills to people in sort of supervisory positions, people supervising in particular the plants where the cane was cooked down and processed into sugar itself, or molasses. It was underwritten, as I've already suggested, by Dutch and Flemish finance capital, and it was extraordinarily profitable. It was profitable as sugar. It was also profitable in the other forms that sugarcane could be turned into, specifically molasses, and from molasses, rum. Rum being particularly attractive because it essentially condensed vast amounts of sugarcane into a much smaller and very stable good that would not go bad. It would not spoil, right? And all of these things could be sold profitably in both elsewhere in the New World, if you wanted to take it to the Americas, for example, and exchange it for other things there, like tobacco, or for directly sale directly into European markets. And here you get a sense, some images to give you a sense of the kind of production system we're talking about. We're talking about the conversion of large landscapes into monocultural fields of sugarcane that were incredibly labor intensive to plant and harvest, right, and maintain. It was slavery similarly was very profitable as a form of trade on its own, and it underwrote the establishment and growth of New World production of things like sugar. Remember, 80 or 90% of the Native Americans died as a result of the Great Dying, and this left the colonial settlers with a shortage of labor power. There simply weren't enough people there to run these plantations, and therefore the importation of slaves from Africa met that need and was absolutely necessary for the establishment of these plantations. And as mentioned already, these settlements in turn provided markets for European manufactured goods. So there was kind of a positive feedback developed, economically speaking, between European markets and plantation colonial production. So here we get, this is the simplest depiction of the triangular trade. This is an extremely important and famous concept for understanding the Atlantic economy of this time period, in which manufactured goods from Europe were taken to Africa and bartered for slaves. Slaves were taken to the West Indies and bartered for raw materials, which were in turn taken back to Europe and turned into finished products, right? Cotton and sugar and tobacco could be turned in, could then feed the growing industrial factory base of Europe. The estimated number of slaves taken from Africa, and most of them went to the Americas, during these time periods. And ignore the page number there, I'm afraid. That refers to another book, not one that you have been asked to read. So, 1451 to 1600, roughly 275,000 slaves. In the 17th century, 1.3 million slaves. In the 18th century, more than 6 million slaves. And then finally, in the 19th century, almost 2 million before the slave trade was effectively and successfully abolished. This depicts the, where they came from, where they went to, and roughly the numbers involved. You can see the point of origin of the slaves moves somewhat. It actually, there's a better map in a second. It starts more in this area and gradually moves south and east. But you can see Brazil is a major destination during all of these time periods. Spanish America, British Caribbean, French Caribbean. And you see a number into North America, but it's actually small compared to the number that was taken to Brazil. And the sugar plantations, again, were the dominant sort of economic destination for these slaves. The trade itself was dominated by Portugal up till about 1600, Holland in the 17th century, England in the 18th century. England actually outlawed the slave trade in 1807, but that still left France, Holland, and Portugal involved in it through the 1800s. Here's a better depiction of the overall slave trade. Only 5% is estimated to have ended up in the United States, 60% in the West Indies, 35% in Brazil. You can see that these points of origin of the slaves crossed over an enormous area and an enormous number of different peoples, different political and social and economic systems contributed. And as I said, this sort of moved over time further and further down the coast of Africa. Now, the question can be raised, why was Africa the fulcrum and the source of slaves for this system? It has to do with its location within the global trade networks. And the key point here being that the Eastern Mediterranean was effectively blocked from the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British by the Ottoman Empire. You couldn't sail into the Eastern Mediterranean as one of those nations and attempt to simply start plundering slaves or participating in trade because the Ottoman Empire was in your way and would prevent you from doing this. This blocked both efforts to trade through the Middle East and forced these other European countries to go around Africa to get to Asia because they couldn't get through what would otherwise have been the logical land route to get to places like India. And it also forced them to look elsewhere for markets and for sources of raw materials. Political economic circumstances at the time also contributed to this. We've already hinted at the rivalries and raiding and warfare. This is talking about within Africa. In other words, the peoples of Africa, although there were some organized, unified political entities that we might even call states in parts of Africa, the general pattern was one of very decentralized political organization and cultural organization. In other words, there wasn't big, single, unified political forces that could push back in an organized fashion against all these European traders and incursions. And it was fairly easy for the Europeans to play different groups off of each other and to tap into existing intra-African trade networks in order to get slaves. In other words, there might be people, African people, who were already traders and who traded things back and forth between the coast and the interior, and who encountered these Europeans, discovered that the Europeans had things they liked, they wanted, whether it was guns or tools or other things, and simply integrated the European trade into their existing trade networks within the interior of Africa, becoming middlemen, in effect. And if the Europeans said what they wanted was slaves, well, these traders were perfectly capable of going and getting slaves from the interior of Africa. That was also something that had been known before, not on this kind of scale, but certainly had been known. And they were active participants as middlemen in much of this trade. Processes of accumulating status and wealth contributed greatly to this, right? If these traders, these coastal middlemen, could get things from the Europeans that were deemed valuable for whatever, from a status point of view or a wealth point of view, or which enabled them to be more powerful themselves, like guns, it was not hard to incentivize or motivate them in those ways. And these European-produced goods quickly became status symbols and tools of hierarchy and sort of asserting your status within existing cultural norms in Africa. The relative shortage of labor in the New World I've already mentioned. That made it very necessary, desirable for the Europeans to find people. And then finally, the powerlessness of displacement and the ease of recognition and enforcement. And by that I mean the Europeans were well aware that if they got these people from Africa and took them all the way across the ocean, they were going to be, the slaves there were going to be less able to resist than they would be on their home turf, so to speak, right? Less able to run away. Where would they run away to? They wouldn't be able to run away home. The Europeans actually very consciously played with these kinds of displacements and senses of disorientation, and also made efforts to mix slaves up, put together slaves from different parts of Africa so that they couldn't communicate easily with each other, to minimize the likelihood that they would organize and resist. And as far as ease of recognition and enforcement, this is the racial marking of slavery that I'll talk about in a moment, right? If all of the slaves were of African descent, it made it a lot easier to identify them as slaves and pursue them if they attempted to escape. Here is another map depicting, again, the complexity of this system over time. Also some numbers attached. I think that's 3.6 million in Brazil. Is that right? 500,000 in Guyana and Suriname. Roughly 1 million into the Mexican and Spanish Caribbean. Jamaica, you see the islands of the Caribbean. But it's also worth remembering that there was significant slave trade within Africa north into the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere in North Africa. This, of course, being handled entirely by Africans, many of them Arab Africans, rather than by Europeans. The slave trade was not only limited to the triangle that we've discussed so far. Now, as I've suggested, there was an enormous diversity of cultures, languages, religions, and ethnicities among slaves. These were intentionally and unintentionally mixed and scattered in the New World. And they only looked like they were all of the same category from the perspective of non-Africans. The Africans themselves could easily distinguish between literally hundreds of different cultural groups, ethnicities, so forth, clans from Africa. But once you viewed it from the perspective of, say, a Portuguese plantation owner, they were all indistinguishably Africans, black, so to speak. The slaves themselves developed a whole variety of new cultural forms in the New World. We've talked about this already in connection with favela rising and capoeira and Afro-reggae, that sort of thing, for which race might or might not be a defining attribute. I've already hinted at the ways in which race is not a biological sort of thing, but rather a socially constructed attribute that's very flexible and malleable. And these new cultural forms might be seen from the perspective of non-Africans as simply African, but again, they were not necessarily a product of race so much as they were a product of the traditions and languages and musical tastes and so forth that came with them from the various places they had originated. So when we think about slavery and racism, it's important to remember that the racial hierarchies that we associate with racism were a product of slavery rather than somehow pre-existing it. It's not like the Europeans said, we'll go get Africans because they are racially inferior. It's much more accurate to say the Africans became slaves for other reasons, and their racial difference came to be used as a way of constructing their inferiority from the vantage point of Europeans. It was a form of labor control in multi-ethnic settings. And if you look closely at the forms of production, the social relations of production that developed over time in places like the Caribbean, it was not simply white owners and black slaves. There were all kinds of other groups involved, including people who were mixtures of whites and indigenous peoples and blacks, people who came from Asia, people who were Creoles of various kinds. And these became ways of, hold it, I skipped a slide, sorry, ways of setting up very complicated hierarchies in which there were intermediate groups that had intermediate status and that helped mediate between the sort of top and bottom of these racialized hierarchies. In other words, there were often free laborers as well as slaves involved in these hierarchies of production, status, legal rights, that sort of thing. The idea of biological race, the idea that this was all about biology, actually emerges later and is sort of built on top of these other kinds of racial hierarchy. So you start seeing blood tests for citizenship or racial identity, the idea that race is rooted in the proportion of your blood that comes from different groups, that sort of thing. In the 19th century, we see theories of social Darwinism emerging that attempt to rationalize and naturalize these hierarchies in terms of evolutionary timescales of change and mutation, as we've already discussed. Anti-Semitism and eugenics and Nazism are closely related to these 19th century developments, okay? Now, we can use as an example to help illustrate this the difference between race in Brazil and the US. I don't believe we talked about this quite yet. It's very interesting. I mean, we've already seen that many, many, many more slaves went to Brazil than went to the US. But the two countries have got radically different sort of social constructs of race through which they deal with or work through these historical legacies. In the US, race was constructed very rigidly as an opposition between black and white, and all kinds of laws and taboos were set up to try to prevent their mixing, right? It was against the law for whites and blacks to be married. It was considered to be highly taboo for them to have children. There was a denial of the fact that this, in fact, happened anyway. And this crops up every once in a while in debates about the categories that should be used in the census, for instance. In Brazil, on the other hand, there was intentional effort made to produce children no matter what. And part of this is that the slaves in Brazil were treated so poorly that they rarely were able to reproduce. If you look at them as a demographic whole, the continued importation of slaves from Africa into Brazil in such large numbers was made necessary by the fact that the slaves working in the sugar plantations could not successfully have kids and raise them. They died too soon. They were not a self-perpetuating population of humans. So the need for additional labor from Africa continued, and the Brazilian, early on the Portuguese, but then the Brazilian government actually consciously encouraged Portuguese and white Brazilians to have children with any woman they could find, because there was such a desperate imbalance between men and women among Portuguese settlers. There were very few women relative to men, and the sense of a need to have people was so great that they actually encouraged the very thing that was illegal in the United States. Which is not to say that there weren't also very strict hierarchies of race in Brazil, or very, I should say, severe. But the mixing in Brazil became so widespread that it's very, very difficult to walk around in Brazil and say, oh, well, there are the black people and there are the white people. There's everybody in between. The spectrum is so huge as to make the whole idea kind of laughable. And again, it's still the case that lighter skin or whiteness in Brazil tends to correlate with wealth and status, but it's not constructed through a rigid black-white opposition the way it is in the United States, or has been in the United States. So that's my little side thing on race and slavery. Are there questions about that? Okay. So here's some wrapping up some key points. First, slavery was not new. It long predated this period within Africa and also within Europe. It was not originally race-based. The slave trade followed and built upon trade in goods, such as gold and spices and ivory. It ramified through and depended upon African social systems. In other words, the role of African social systems in articulating with the slave trade was very important. And finally, the sources of the slaves migrated over time, generally south and east, as already suggested. We aren't reading it this year, but in previous years I've asked students to read a book called Sweetness and Power by Sidney Mintz, who's an anthropologist. And it discusses this relationship between European industrialism and European industrial development in the 19th century and plantation sugar production in the New World beginning much earlier. And he makes the case that the production of sugar by slaves in the New World not only helped inspire or provide a template for industrial production in Europe, which is a new kind of argument. The general way this is portrayed is, no, industrialism is a European thing and grows up in Europe and then goes elsewhere. And he's suggesting, no, in some important ways, in fact, you could read it the other way around. You could say things got figured out in plantation settings that then were taken back and applied to the production of other goods in Europe. Forms of labor control, that sort of thing, even though we tend to think of them as very different. But he also makes the case that the production of sugar in the New World also helped underwrite the production of the working class in Europe. And by this, to substantiate this argument, he looks at evidence such as this. And you track the pounds per capita per year of sugar in Great Britain from 1815 to 1955. And you can see that the amount of sugar being consumed goes up by a factor of 10 over that time period. It grows very, very strongly and steadily through the latter half of the 19th century. And once it gets to the 20th century, rates are very high. It's also very susceptible to disruptions associated with international trade and war, right? Now, in 1650, Mintz points out, sugar was a total luxury item. Very, very few people could get their hands on it. It was very expensive. By 1750, it was used pretty widely, at least in people's tea, for example. By 1850, it was being consumed at a rate of 50 pounds per year per person, and it was basically a staple of the diet in Great Britain. And by 1900, it represented 1/6 of the total caloric intake of the British people, 90 pounds per year per capita. This was differentially distributed by class. If you look, the white bars representing people with more than 90 pounds per week of income, the shaded bars less than 33 pounds per week, and you see that the lower classes, the working classes, consumed almost twice as much sugar as the well-to-do, and almost half as much in the way of fresh vegetables, for example. This was a cheap source of calories that was ravenously taken up by the British of all classes, but especially by the British working classes. And Mintz's argument is basically this. Sugar expanded so rapidly, it got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and it was a great way of keeping the working classes fed, right? Giving them a bunch of calories so that they would not be hungry and they would have the energy they need to work in the factories, and it would cost less and less and less over time to provide them with those calories. They weren't necessarily very good calories as far as nutritional considerations are concerned, but they were, he suggests, a very important part of keeping the cost of labor down and keeping the working class masses fed in such a way as to make continued industrial growth and expansion and exploitation possible. Any questions? Okay. This is our last slide for today, I believe. Yes. Uh-oh. I'll go back to it. So, how do we understand the relationship of colonialism and capitalism? And here again, these are directly from Bernstein. He says, capitalism is the production of goods and services for market exchange rather than direct consumption to make a profit. Does that sound straightforward enough? It's the idea that in a capitalist society, the preponderance of goods are produced explicitly to be exchanged for a profit. The number of things that are produced for direct consumption by the people producing them is, it's still there, but it's insignificant by comparison. It's founded on a class relationship between owners of capital and owners of labor power. And here is where we get back to this question of land and labor. Bernstein emphasizes, he says, there are plenty of examples of other societies from other places and times in which things were produced for exchange and profit and money lending were present. What they didn't have was this second thing, this class relationship in which you had, on the one side, people who owned the means of production, and on the other side, people who didn't and who had to sell their labor power as a commodity in order to live. In other words, they were dependent solely on that. And if that's going to be the case, it needs to be the case, generally speaking, that they don't have an alternative. If they have land and tools and seed and can grow their own food, and let's face it, historically, that was what the majority of people did do and knew how to do and had done for a long time. If they had those things, they could raise their own food. In order to ensure that they would sell their labor power instead, they had to essentially lose those means of production, lose the land and the tools and the seed, that sort of thing. Now, that's a very long, complicated process in, well, anywhere you want to look at it. In the United Kingdom, it's been studied at enormous length, and it took hundreds of years, and it's not something you can sort of crystallize into a single, simple statement. Nonetheless, looked at in gross, this is a process that's come to be known as primitive accumulation, in which land and labor become commodities. They become things that are bought and sold as factors of production just like anything else. And this is accompanied by this creation of a group of people who don't have anything else, any other way to make a living other than by selling their labor power. And this becomes definitive of industrial capitalism in ways that are important for the subsequent discussion here. Are there questions? Does this all seem terribly dry? People concerned that it's not going to be as exciting in the second half as it was in this first half. No, I promise it will get exciting. All right, we will see you next week.